It's December 1773, and a Scottish explorer named James Bruce walks into the royal court in Paris, fresh off a 6-year trek through North Africa and Ethiopia, chasing the source of the Nile. He's exhausted. He's been gone so long people assumed he was dead, and he's carrying something in his bags that nobody in Western Europe has held in their hands for over 1,000 years. He presents it to King Louis XV. It's a manuscript written in an old African language called Gez, and it's a complete copy of the Book of Enoch. Not a fragment, not a quote buried in some old church father's letter. The whole thing, intact, sitting quietly in Ethiopia the entire time, while the rest of the world acted like it had vanished off the face of the earth. And before I go any further, same disclaimer as always, this isn't a Bible study. I'm not handing you scripture, and I'm not telling you Christianity has a secret 13th disciple cover-up going on. This is history, and it's a genuinely strange piece of it. Because here's the question that's been sitting underneath this discovery ever since Bruce walked into that room. How does a book that early Christians openly quoted as prophecy just disappear from the conversation for over a millennium, everywhere except one isolated kingdom in East Africa? Was that an accident of history? Or did somebody at some point decide on purpose that this book needed to go? Let's actually dig into it, because the real answer is messier and honestly more interesting than a simple yes or no. First, let's get one thing straight, because most videos on this topic get it wrong immediately. Enoch was never removed from the Bible in the sense of some council ripping a page out of an existing finished book. There was no single finished Bible sitting around in the 1st century waiting to be edited down. What actually happened is slower and stranger than that. Both the Jewish community and the early Christian community were independently working out over centuries which ancient writings counted as authoritative scripture and which ones didn't. And Enoch kept showing up right at the edge of that conversation, again and again, getting argued about by name by people we can actually identify, with motives we can actually trace. So let's start with how seriously this book was once taken, because the case against it just quietly faded away is honestly pretty strong. Out at Qumran, the settlement near the Dead Sea where the scrolls were eventually found, archaeologists recovered multiple separate Aramaic copies of Enoch across several different caves, which tells you this wasn't some obscure pamphlet nobody bothered with. People kept copying it over and over, generation after generation. Early Christian writers treated it the same way. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian all reference its content as though it carries real weight, and Tertullian goes a step further, arguing directly that Noah would have deliberately preserved Enoch's writings before the flood, specifically because they mattered. And then there's the detail that should genuinely stop you if you've never sat with it before. The New Testament book of Jude doesn't allude to Enoch. It quotes Enoch directly, word for word, in verses 14 and 15, and introduces the quote by saying, "Enoch prophesied, saying." An inspired New Testament author cites this exact text as legitimate prophecy. That's not a fringe detail. That's about as strong an endorsement as an ancient document could possibly get.
All right. Hang on to this thought for a second, because there's a very specific reason the mood around this book changed, and it isn't the giants, it isn't the violence, it isn't even really the angels. It's something else entirely, tied to a heresy you've probably heard of, but never connected to Enoch, and we're coming back to it shortly. Quick pause here, because as always, I want to be straight with you about where this research is coming from. A huge amount of what's in this video traces back to years of work from researchers like Ken Johnson, digging through Second Temple Jewish literature and early church history in the kind of detail most channels never bother with. If this is the kind of thing you find genuinely interesting, his books take you a lot deeper than 15 minutes ever could. And the usual honesty note: if I slightly misstate a detail anywhere in here, that's on me, not him. I'm just telling the story. This channel doesn't run ads, so if you want to help keep this kind of research going, there's a Ko-Fi link in the description. All right, back to it. So here's the shift. By the late 2nd and early 3rd century, you start seeing real hesitation creep in, even from scholars who clearly respected the text. Origen, who quotes from Enoch elsewhere like it's worth engaging with, also starts adding qualifiers, treating it more cautiously than scripture proper. Later, Hilary of Poitiers pushes back against it outright. And then you get to Jerome, the man who would eventually translate the entire Bible into Latin for the Vulgate, and he's openly skeptical, listing Enoch among writings he considers questionable in authorship and origin, rather than genuinely ancient. That decision, by one extremely influential scholar sitting down to translate what would become the standard Bible of the entire Western Church for the next 1,000 years, and simply not including Enoch, did more to bury this book in Western Christianity than any single dramatic ban ever could have. But the real turning point, the one most people never hear about, comes from Augustine. In his massive work, City of God, in Book 15, he tackles the Watchers story directly, the angels and the giants and all of it, and he says plainly that writings attributed to Enoch shouldn't be trusted as authentic, partly because the text survived in suspiciously clean, readable condition for something supposedly written before a flood that wiped out almost everyone on earth. His argument is essentially real scripture comes down to us through a known, traceable, faithful chain of custody, not through a convenient story about a book getting smuggled past a global catastrophe. Now, here's where that earlier thread comes back in. Augustine wasn't approaching this book as a neutral outsider. Before he became a Christian, he spent close to a decade as a devoted follower of Manichaeism, a rival religious movement that taught the world was caught in an ongoing war between two equal cosmic forces, light and darkness, and that evil entered human experience from the outside, almost like a contamination seeping in from somewhere else entirely. Enoch's entire framework runs uncomfortably close to that idea. In Enoch, corruption doesn't originate from a human choice. It gets handed down by outside beings, fallen angels passing along forbidden knowledge that humanity never asked for and never could have invented on its own. Augustine, fresh off rejecting Manichaean theology, was busy building what would become Christianity's defining doctrine on sin, the idea that human corruption flows specifically from Adam's own free choice in the garden, not from some external cosmic leak. A book whose most famous section explains evil arriving from the outside through angels was never going to sit comfortably next to a doctrine insisting sin had to originate from inside through one man's free decision. That tension wasn't an accident, it was personal, and it was theological, and it came from a man who knew exactly what he was rejecting because he used to believe a version of it himself.
There's another layer to this that almost never gets mentioned, and it's the moment the exclusion stopped being a matter of individual scholars having doubts and started becoming official church policy. In 367 AD, the bishop Athanasius of Alexandria wrote what's now called his 39th festal letter, and it's genuinely one of the first documents in church history to draw a hard line between books he calls canonical and a separate category he labels apocryphal, writings he specifically warns were invented to mislead the simple-minded. He doesn't call out Enoch by name in the surviving text, but the entire category he's defining, ancient writings claiming prophetic authority outside the accepted list, is exactly the bucket Enoch had been sitting in for over a century by that point. A few decades later, regional church councils at Hippo and Carthage, the same gatherings that helped settle which books belonged in the New Testament, were applying that same instinct more broadly across the whole of Scripture. Does it come from a verifiable apostolic or prophetic source? Has it been consistently used in worship across many regions? Does it line up cleanly with established doctrine? Enoch failed that test on more than one count, not because anyone proved it was fake, but because by then influential voices had already spent a century building the case that it didn't qualify. And councils tend to formalize momentum that's already there, rather than create it from nothing. There's also a quieter, more practical reason mainstream Judaism kept its distance, and it's tied to something we touched on earlier: Enoch's calendar. The astronomical book lays out a clean 364-day solar year, and the Qumran community built their entire religious calendar, every feast day, every Sabbath cycle, around that exact system, instead of the lunar calendar followed by the Jerusalem priesthood and eventually standardized across Rabbinic Judaism. That wasn't a minor scheduling quirk. It meant the Qumran community was quite literally never celebrating Passover on the same day as everyone else, which is about as clear a marker of separation as a religious community can produce. Once Enochic literature became associated with a breakaway calendar and a breakaway community, distancing the mainstream tradition from Enoch's text wasn't just a theological move. It was a way of drawing a line around who counted as religiously legitimate and who didn't. And the losing side of that argument is exactly whose books stopped getting copied. At the same time, this wasn't only a Christian story. Long before Augustine was even born, Jewish religious authority was already settling into a particular shape, centered on the temple, the priesthood, and eventually the rabbinic schools that rebuilt Jewish religious life after the temple's destruction in 70 AD. Scholars who study this period, Gabriele Bocconcini among the most prominent, describe an entire rival strand of ancient Judaism built around Enoch's visions, sometimes called Enochic Judaism, with its own calendar, its own explanation for where evil came from, and its own expectations about the end of the age, running parallel to and occasionally clashing with the mainstream priestly establishment in Jerusalem. The Qumran community that preserved so many copies of Enoch were part of that broader Enochic current, and they were also notably on the losing side of Jewish religious history. When the dust settled after Rome crushed Jerusalem, the tradition that survived and rebuilt Judaism going forward wasn't the Enochic one. It's hard to prove a deliberate single decision to bury a rival movement's literature. But it's just as hard to ignore that the books belonging to the side that lost the argument are exactly the books that quietly stopped getting copied.
There's one more wrinkle to the Jewish side of this that almost nobody outside academic circles ever hears about, and it actually makes the exclusion look even more deliberate. The Ethiopic Book of Enoch you usually hear about, the one with the Watchers and the Giants, is technically just one Enoch text among several. There's a separate one, usually called Slavonic Enoch, preserved only in Old Church Slavonic manuscripts, that describes Enoch's tour through 10 separate heavens instead of the handful described in the Ethiopic version. And there's a third one, Hebrew Enoch, written centuries later within Jewish mystical circles, that goes even further, describing Enoch being transformed bodily into a towering angelic being named Metatron, standing right beside God's own throne. That third text belongs to a tradition called Merkaba mysticism, an entire current of Jewish thought built around dangerous, carefully guarded visions of God's throne chariot. And mainstream rabbinic authorities grew increasingly wary of it, precisely because it encouraged ordinary people to attempt direct angelic ascent rather than sticking to safer, more controlled forms of religious practice. Several rabbinic sources actively discourage casual study of this material, warning that it isn't safe for just anyone to dig into. So you've got 3 separate strands of Enoch literature, spread across 3 different languages and 3 different eras, and every single one of them eventually drew suspicion from whichever religious establishment was nearest to it. not for the same reason every time, but for reasons that kept landing in the same general place. This material gives too much detail about heaven, angels, and cosmic order, handled by the wrong hands, and institutions kept deciding that detail needed to be restricted rather than spread. Here's another loop worth opening, because there's a specific reason this book survived completely intact in exactly one place on Earth, and it has nothing to do with luck. Stick with me, because the answer to that connects directly back to where we started, in that room in Paris in 1773. While all of this exclusion was happening across the Mediterranean world, Ethiopia was simply never part of the conversation. Christianity arrived there in the 4th century, traditionally credited to a missionary named Frumentius, and the Ethiopian Church developed its own identity largely outside the reach of the councils and translation decisions happening in Rome, Constantinople, and Carthage. Nobody in Aksum was sitting in on Jerome's translation committee. Nobody there felt obligated to follow Augustine's reasoning about suspicious chains of custody. The Ethiopian Church simply kept treating Enoch the way much of the early Church once had, as a legitimate, valuable, even scriptural text, and it stayed that way for well over 1,000 years while the rest of Christendom moved in a completely different direction. That's not an accident of geography. That's what happens when a community sits outside the institutional decisions being made everywhere else. And it's the entire reason James Bruce had anything to bring back to Paris at all.
So now you've got two separate exclusion stories running at the same time, on two different continents, in two different religions, for two different sets of theological reasons, and they both land on the exact same book. The Jewish mainstream moved away from Enochic literature as the priestly and rabbinic establishment consolidated power after the temple fell. The Christian mainstream moved away from it as influential figures like Jerome and Augustine made specific, documented, individually traceable decisions about authenticity and theology, decisions shaped by their own personal histories and their own doctrinal priorities. Neither one of those is a single secret meeting where a committee voted to erase a book from human memory. But both of them are absolutely unmistakably decisions made by named people for reasons we can actually point to. That's a very different thing from "it just got lost," and it's also a very different thing from a Hollywood-style cover-up. It's something in between, slower, more human, and honestly more believable than either extreme. And once Bruce's 3 manuscripts landed in Europe, the slow process of recovery began. The texts mostly sat untouched in European libraries for decades, until 1821, when an Oxford Hebrew scholar named Richard Lawrence finally produced the first complete English translation, working straight from the Ethiopic manuscript sitting in the Bodleian Library. For the first time in well over 1,000 years, English-speaking readers could sit down and actually read the entire Book of Enoch for themselves, instead of relying on second-hand quotes scattered through old church father writings. That single translation reignited serious academic interest in the text, decades before anyone had even heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then, in 1947, that shepherd accidentally found those Qumran caves, and the Aramaic fragments inside them proved this wasn't some elaborate Ethiopian invention or medieval forgery, exactly the accusation skeptical European scholars had thrown at it for over a century. The fragments lined up with the Ethiopic text closely enough to confirm the core material really did stretch back to the centuries before Christ, exactly as the Ethiopic Church had been quietly insisting the entire time. So, was it removed on purpose? Here's the honest answer, and it's more layered than a simple yes or no. Nobody convened a single secret tribunal and voted this book out of existence in one afternoon. But across several centuries, in 2 different religious traditions, specific identifiable people, Origen with his hesitations, Jerome with his translation choices,
Augustine with his theological history and his personal break from Manichaeism, and an entire generation of Jewish religious leaders rebuilding authority after the temple's destruction, all independently arrived at decisions that pushed this book toward the margins, for reasons that had everything to do with protecting a particular version of where evil comes from, who gets to define Scripture, and which religious faction's worldview ultimately won. Add all of that together across enough centuries, and on purpose, stop sounding like a conspiracy theory and start sounding like the most accurate description available. Not erased, edged out, deliberately, one decision at a time, by people who knew exactly what they were choosing to leave behind. So, back to that room in Paris, December of 1773. A king turning the pages of a book the rest of his continent had spent over 1,000 years pretending didn't exist anymore. If this kind of deep dive research is your thing, there's a lot more where this came from, and Ken Johnson's actual work goes a lot further than any one video ever could. And if you want to keep going down this road with me, hit subscribe, because next time we're getting into what the Ethiopic Church actually believes about Enoch today, and why they never once stopped treating him as Scripture. You're going to want to see that one.